Welcome to another installment of Cooperatives in a Time of Crisis Conversations series. This series of conversations is offered by the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. I'm Jen Budney, and I'm a research associate with the Centre. And I'm super happy to have today Hazel Corcoran on the other side of the Zoom screen, coming in from Nova Scotia to talk about her work with the Canadian Workers Cooperative Federation. And welcome, Hazel.
Thank you, Jen. Pleasure to be here.
So you have been very busy, I see. You've already put out a letter to federal politicians on behalf of workers' co-ops. I want to talk about all the work you're doing and your hopes and fears for the economy and for the cooperative sector. But first, if you could tell me a little bit about the work you do with the Federation and your involvement with it. You've been associated with the Federation for 30 years now, and executive director for 20 years.
Yeah.
So that's a very deep history.
Yeah, it's actually I've been executive director a little bit longer than 20 years, but I'm worried about the more backlight I've got going here. Anyway, yeah, so what we've been doing through the pandemic is, I mean, first of all, you know, I think we were quite worried about how our members were going to do. And I'm happy to report that it seems that with some exceptions, for the most part, the worker co-ops out there in the country are doing better than average, which I think one would expect. Part of it is because they tend to be in, I think, somewhat more essential services, you know, whether it's food related, coffee, chocolates, groceries, you know, or consulting, sometimes IT, sometimes other consulting that can be done from home, healthcare related in some cases, or home health and that kind of thing, or paramedic services, for example. That's one big sector in Quebec, or because they can just be more adaptable. But in a variety of ways, I think they're doing better than average. I'm not aware of any worker co-ops having decided to close at this stage. There's one that may close that we know of, and I think there's some uncertainty, but relative to what we're hearing in the general economy, I think they're doing a bit better, which, you know, we didn't know in the beginning. And then we were sort of pleasantly surprised to realize that's what seemed to be happening. But you know, I think in general, the concern is that, you know, if you hear from the sort of mainstream business groups like the CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and so on, the overall economy is clearly, you know, in very dire straits with huge unemployment and, you know, many businesses either closed and not knowing if they're going to reopen, or having declared bankruptcy in, you know, various ways of heading toward closure. So obviously the overall picture is very concerning, and nobody knows where we're going to land. I mean, you know, we're sort of in this phase where we're trying to figure out how to reopen, obviously, but this is sort of what we think. So our federation has been able to adapt some of our programming and look at providing that to our membership. And interestingly enough, we've found that in many cases, it's not actually been needed. And so we've got a deadline this weekend, you know, the end of the month, for some of the programming we put out there for emergency use. And then after that, I think we're quite likely going to go back to the sort of usual programming, because we have seen some co-ops, you know, looking to start up and that kind of thing in a sort of normal fashion. And those applications are just sort of on hold. But anyway, so we've been, I guess, pleasantly surprised as to how our direct sector is affected, but obviously share the concerns that everyone has for, you know, where the economy in general will land.
Right. And so you have quite a small staff given your mandate, which is very broad. I'm wondering if you could describe briefly the different things that the Federation does.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. So our federation, which is for and of and by worker co-ops and related kinds of co-ops across the country, sort of has two buckets, I guess you might say. There's our broader mandate for supporting the worker co-ops that exist, to help new co-ops, new worker co-ops to start, to bring together the worker co-ops that exist, whether it's through webinars. Lately, we've been doing a sort of a series of virtual meetups during the pandemic with either myself, we're doing virtual coffee breaks with the ED, or we're doing occasional virtual pub nights with the regional directors. And then, you know, we do normally conferencing and so on. This year, everything will be virtual, but in most years, we would do a fall in-person conference. What we've got scheduled next for in-person, in lieu of a couple of other things that were to happen, it's basically 2021, fall of 2021 in Vancouver. This fall, if it's possible, like say November-ish, we're going to do some region events in each of the 5 main regions of the country. But anyways, so there's a sort of like broad mandate to promote and develop and support the worker co-op movement in the country, which, by the way, I'll just mention is very focused in Quebec. You know, 2/3 of our indirect, or 2/3 of our direct or indirect members are in Quebec.
And how many members do you have in total?
Well, depending on how you count, I would say the worker co-op space, it's 150, with 50 of them being direct members of us in the provinces outside Quebec, and 100 being indirect in Quebec, through the 3 region federations that are there. One being the paramedic sector, one being forestry sector federation, and the other being, it's called the réseau, which means network, for all of the worker co-ops and other sectors in Quebec. So, but beside the sort of broad mandate of what one would expect a federation in our sector to do, we also have another bucket for the RRSP TFSA program we run, and that is enabling folks to invest in securities in cooperatives and sort of related type entities that aren't necessarily worker co-ops. So we have a variety of associate members that are using the program because, frankly, we have a very good rate, and yet we can still make a small surplus on it to help us to run our other programs. So
amazing. So do you run that completely independently?
Well, we run it independently, but we have behind us, I think of it as we have a contract with Concentra Financial, so that they have the relationship to the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, and what we do is we provide all the front-facing services to the co-ops and the community economic development funds that use the program. Mm-hmm. And they provide the Bear Trustee Services, it's called, into Concentra. We don't have a contract or a presence with the CRA directly, but they do. So that's very helpful, because whenever we run into any complications, or, you know, also we can use them, use their services on sort of a consulting basis. And then also, we have a variety of reporting requirements, and they help us navigate what they all are and so on. So it's a very helpful and collaborative relationship with them.
Sounds like it. How long have you had that program going on?
Let's see. That's a good question. I would guesstimate 10 years that we've been running it, and longer than that it has existed, but previously Concentra was providing that service into our members, and while we've been running it, it's grown very significantly, and we're about to start offering it as well to nonprofits who want to raise financing through community bonds. So we expect it's going to grow even further. So actually, we've got, with our small staff team, we have 7 people on staff with 4 FTE, full-time equivalent, and about half is to run the RSP program. So yeah, the challenge we have is there's 3 of us, like myself full-time and 2 people half-time, who are doing the mandate of the organization. But luckily for us, we have a great network of people who are worker co-op developers that work quite closely with us, or on committees, or, you know, out with the co-ops. So a big thing that we do is we provide some small grants to enable work by consultants with co-ops in development or with existing worker co-ops so that they can get help with various issues they might be facing in management or governance or whatever it might be. So that's a really effective way that we found to kind of cover the country and amplify what we can do with the movement. So over the co-ops out there.
And so, you know, I was speaking with your colleague, Melissa Hoover from the Democracy at Work Institute earlier today. And like many people I've interviewed from the co-op sector, she identified that this is, you know, despite a lot of misfortune that people are suffering, it is a moment of opportunity. And now that we are presented with, I guess, not just the opportunity, but the need really to rethink how we run our economies. And with the failing of so many small and medium-sized enterprises, which you were noting earlier, it's a real opportunity to present the co-op model as an alternative, as a way of keeping these businesses alive for the well-being of everyone who's employed there. I know that you have done a lot of work in this area very recently, trying to initiate a conversation with the federal government on this subject. I'm wondering if you could tell me all about that.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the high-level summary of how I would see this is that our federation has been thinking about and seeing the opportunity for conversions of existing businesses, especially where owners are retiring, to employee ownership with a democratic model to worker cooperatives, basically, for about 15 years. And I think we were ahead of the curve because, you know, with the baby boomer generation, right? I mean, these folks are retiring now. And we were predicting that, you know, in 2005 or thereabouts. And so we did a research project back then on this topic, and we hired our then fund manager, Peter Huff, or he worked on this project with federal funding to study the opportunity. And this is a paper that's, I think, was leading edge on the topic, and he went down to Ohio and worked with the Ohio Employee Ownership Center and so on. So, you know, from then on, we were looking for resources to actually do something about it. And, you know, we poked around and looked in the Co-op Development Initiative and at ACOA and a few other places and couldn't get resources at the time. And then eventually in 2011, we hosted a major international conference on this topic. And we were hopeful that we might be able to find some federal resources. We held the conference in Quebec City, and as it turned out, and I have no idea if there was any degree of cause and effect, but shortly thereafter, the Quebec government, which had been a bit involved at our event, they announced a program for Quebec, which has resulted in a lot of activity there. And there's been a major buy of a newspaper in Quebec turning into a worker co-op and so on. But in any event, you know, we've had this idea for a long time, and coming up to the current government, we were talking to them early on. And long story short, you know, after various versions of a proposal over the last few years, when the pandemic hit, we realized that, you know, not only is it a good idea for retiring owners that we've been thinking for a long time, but I think without that much urgency on the government's part to see why they needed new solutions. And then suddenly there was a lot of urgency. And so we pulled together on the basis of, you know, prior work, not only with the Business Succession Committee and the Business Succession Proposal, but also with the Tenacity Works Fund that we've been running for quite a long while, and that has been frankly too small to have enough impact, you know. We worked on a new proposal very quickly in sort of a summary version to respond to the needs that are out there, because I think what's going on now is, you know, so many businesses are either closing or threatened with closure that the government doesn't know where to go. And a kind of common thing that we've seen is if governments have as part of their sort of toolkit the idea that a cooperative solution, a worker cooperative solution could come in, it really does, it can actually strengthen the whole economy. I mean, there are many studies internationally and in the country that show we're finding it ourselves, right, that worker cooperatives tend to have a better track record of survival because everybody's an owner. It's just like if you own your house, you probably treat it a bit differently than if you're a renter, and especially if you're a renter with a bad landlord. I think giving people that ownership collectively can really have great impacts. And so we're trying to help government and work with government in a partnership kind of way to say, we know how to do this. Our members know how to do this. Our developers know how to do this. Can we partner? And we've been involved in various different kinds of lobby campaigns. Like early on, we had to lobby to get cooperatives eligible for the kinds of RRSP program that we're now running, which is generalized. People can go to other trustees and do this sort of thing, but we've lobbied to get our fund. We lobbied in a variety of spaces, some successful and some not. And I have rarely seen as much interest as we're seeing in our current proposal, because clearly there's a big problem and we have one solution to offer. I don't know how many solutions are offered, but it is one. And so we are getting some interest, and we don't know yet where it will land. A challenge for our approach, I think, is that it's very much a national pan-Canadian idea that says, anywhere that businesses are closing, whatever size they may be, think about, is there a solution for employees and or community together to buy the business so that it's a partially or fully worker-owned cooperative? Well, there aren't really any programs that address that. It's all been kind of regionalized. So there's Western diversification in the West, and the COA in the East, and various others in the middle. And I think there are 7 different regional development agencies now. And, that's probably where the programming would kind of get sent. But then, of course, they'll have different mandates and different sort of approaches and programs. And so I think right now our challenge is to try to convince the government to do something.
Sorry, I was going to say probably different understandings of the cooperative model as well.
That too, yes, absolutely, yeah. So some of them get that model and some of them less so, and there's a whole variety of issues. So, but hopefully there's going to be a champion that we can find from whichever ministry that says this is an important enough idea that we should figure out how to make it work without creating a lot of obstacles to having it go, and make it work in some places and not others, because I think it will work in certain areas and not. And by the way, I would just mention that our idea is not that we should grow our staff in some giant way and have you, but it's more to work with this network of developers and associations like the provincial co-op associations that have, capacity to do this, and say it should be a partnership approach collectively, and certainly Quebec as well. The fact that the movement is so present there, we wouldn't see CWCF directly in any way delivering it there. It would be definitely in conjunction with our members and associates there.
Yeah, so that's really exciting. We have two questions. The first one would be, have you had any responses to your proposal yet? And the second one, everything you're saying reminds me of a conversation I did have with Melissa Hoover as well, where she talked about the resiliency of the cooperative model being not something that we should reduce down to individual organizations, but the resiliency exists as part of a broader network, a web of related institutions and policies and all of those things. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the health of that context, that web, that network, for Canadian cooperatives, what your perspective is on that. So the first one is responses to your proposal, and the second one about this broader resiliency.
Well, the good news is that yes, we have had responses. So I think there's been 4 ministers' offices to date that have responded: finance, economic development, small business, and the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and related. So those ministries have responded, and also I think the Privy Council person that we've spoken to as well, which is great. So I mean, the responses we have are like, really, we've only begun to do this in a really serious way as of late last week with in conjunction with the government relations consultant that we're working with. So since we've done that, we have these responses so far, and they're really beginnings of a discussion as to like their questionings and their first reactions. But I think we feel that it's a good, you know, set of responses. Like we've had the idea for a while, but we've kind of put that together as an executive summary early on. And, you know, in the beginning, we really just only heard from sort of like friends to us. Like there's one particular senator that we know well who is a known co-op champion who reached out early on. And also we heard from the Green Party early on. But as far as the Liberal government, you know, it's really been very recent that we had more of a proposal to share that was, you know, more in depth, that isn't actually available on our website yet. But we've got like a 14 or 15 page, more detailed version of what you see there as the executive summary. And then we also have a sort of a one page, like more formal request to meet kind of thing. So we've been getting the meetings already. And I think there've been 3 this week and another couple scheduled for next week. And so that's very positive for an early take up. I think we're very much hearing that the government is interested in solutions that in particular are helpful for youth and for multicultural and immigrant Canadians, like racialized Canadians and immigrants, because that's where there's more of a concern and an issue that the jobs aren't going to come back as fast. And also in the tourism sector, which obviously is, you know, very hard hit. So that's interesting to hear that they've got, you know, some very specific ideas. And there are certainly some, I mean, there are many worker co-ops among youth. I mean, I think it's businesses with a lot of youth involved. And by the way, we have one example of a possible sort of conversion, but complicated, which is Foodora, right? Because they've closed in Canada, although they're a public company, so it's known they've had record profits through the pandemic.
Right,
but
and just for people who aren't familiar with Foodora, it's a food delivery service.
Correct, yeah, it's a food delivery service that's app-based, application-based, and it closed down just earlier this month with, I think, about 2 weeks notice. And so I know that some of the young folks that primarily work for them, because they're in many cities, I think what they're doing is bicycle delivery. So it's often young people and who would take those jobs and have those jobs. And anyway, so there's a group of them that are actively talking about this opportunity to form a worker co-op, and we've been in touch with them to some degree. And I know some of them are also engaged in this. There's a platform Co-ops Now conference, or sorry, online training rather, that's going to happen starting Monday. That's been pulled together kind of worldwide very quickly out of Mondragon, the Mondragon co-op movement in Spain. Excuse me, and the New School University out of New York City, which are real leaders in this space. And we're a bit involved in delivering some of that for the Canadian participants, which is exciting. So, you know, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's where the interest is. And I think there's a youth strategy that's being pulled together by the federal government somewhere in the next kind of 2 to 3 weeks, wrapping it up. So we're hoping that it may be part of that. And anyway, so that's the response we're getting. And just part of what we're hearing is, you know, we're a pretty small organization, although experienced, but, you know, to be pulling together the scale of what we're looking for, which is $100 million proposal. And so we're clearly stating we see it as a phased in thing, and like look at something like a fifth of that as a sort of pilot almost, you know. And so the first sort of tranche would be 20 million, and say if that goes well and we have some results to show, just judge it on the results, that's all we're looking for, then go from there. And I mean, although it's in some ways hard for a smaller nonprofit federation to say, you know, 20 million is not big dollars when you look at what government is doing now. And a big part of what we're proposing is capital into the fund, right? So that if the Tenacity Works Fund that has a track record of success as it's been doing, can say, okay, give the 20 million and most of it's going to go into capital, then it's a revolving fund that continues, and it's not constant need to be fed by government, because it can revolve and go on when it's repaid into other co-ops in the future. So that is appealing to government too. So overall, it's going fairly well. We don't know yet. I mean, we're optimistic, but we don't know yet where it's going to land. And really, I think, depends on how quickly it gets a champion. And there's a couple of places where that might be forthcoming. On your second question, which is a great one, around the importance of this sort of people talk about an ecosystem of worker co-op development, and also the solidarity economy. And I think, to me, the notion that some workplaces are democratic and workers actually control their jobs and their workplace and so on, and their employer, it's a central part of what I think of as the solidarity economy, which is everything from, I guess, nonprofits to some degree, but certainly through to like social enterprise and worker co-ops and other kinds of co-ops. And I guess I see it as sort of a continuum, but there's a whole variety of supports that exist for this kind of economy, the solidarity economy. And I feel that although we're a relatively small entity, we're extraordinarily well networked. And in fact, the person who's been taking the lead on a small contract to draft the proposal asked me to spend a little time like just creating a list of all the players who could be engaged in helping to deliver the program, right? And it's everything from the credit unions, especially the ones that we're most aware of and are involved in this kind of work, the provincial associations of cooperatives, the membership in the Canadian CED network, and those sorts of people, to individuals who are, progressive lawyers or accountants that we know of through our network, and individual co-op developers. And I mean, honestly, he suggested just take half an hour and put a list together. And I mean, I couldn't even just going at it for half an hour. It was nowhere close to enough, because there are so many, so we have this very long list. And I think it's sort of like a picture of the supports to the solidarity economy that we're just either members of, or there are members, or both. It's quite extensive, and it's real, and it comes together at certain places. Like this group, not uncommonly, will hang out in our conferences or on webinars that we're hosting. And so I think we're very well connected to it, and it exists. It's not kind of a cohesive group you can point to and say, like, there it is, the way you can in Quebec, maybe more easily, but it's certainly there and is ready to be engaged in this work if it can be resourced. I think this is the issue right now, is that generally speaking, to do this work, it's too commonly the case that individuals or organizations have to decide, can we do this for free? And if we can't, well, it may well not get done. But the supports are available. And what's extraordinary about this particular time in history, in addition to the obvious unprecedented nature of the pandemic, is that I think a lot of that expertise that exists in this space is in fact made up of folks who are boomers who may retire in the next 10 years or less, and they've got extraordinary experience. Like on this business succession committee of our federation, we have 15 people right now. And of those who responded with biographies, which was about 10 of them, maybe 12, we counted up their years of experience, and it was 390. So like probably on average, there's 35 years experience of the people who responded. And there were a couple of younger folk who couldn't have had that experience unless they've been working from birth, but so that's extraordinary. And my sense is that, if we can capture that experience now and have these folks working with converting co-ops, along with younger folks who are interested in this space, and there are a lot of them, that's a really great opportunity to capture that experience. And if we can't do it soon, they're going to retire or something else, right? They're going to be gone. And so we have to capture it soon. I hope that we can take the opportunity of this current crisis to get resources to enable that transfer of knowledge. Like we'd be transferring not only businesses, but also knowledge from some extraordinary co-op developers and lawyers and so on, who aren't going to be working much longer. And so I'm hopeful and feeling it's needed, you know, for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm. So beyond resources, if you could make a wish list for what you'd like to see happen in the policy environment, either federally or provincially across different provinces, what would your wish list look like?
That's a great question. So beyond financial resources, and by the way, we're including financial resources for the capital fund as well as for technical assistance piece for, you know, the developers and the lawyers and so on out there doing the work. But also we would like to see policy change such that worker co-ops across the country, especially those that are getting these supports, would have to have what we call indivisible reserves, which are basically the kind of reserves one sees in nonprofits generally, or charities, which are not divisible among individuals, right? So that the notion is that just like you have in nonprofits and charities that no individual can have access to the reserves they build up, it's the same in cooperatives. So what we see is in the parts of the world where the worker co-op movement is really growing and exploding, and there are quite a lot of them, but very commonly indivisible reserves are in legislation. So we would build that into our programming, but it would be lovely to see it kind of more required than that, or required if there were government supports flowing, because certainly in Quebec, where there are a lot of government supports for various pieces of co-op development, of worker co-op and other co-op development, it is required by all co-ops to have indivisible reserves. And one sees that in all the parts of the world where the worker co-op movement is really thriving pretty much. Spain, Italy, Argentina, France, I mean, most of the places. So that's one thing I'd love to see. I'd love to see the rules around RRSP investments somewhat changed because they were amended in the year 2011, such that it's a lot harder for small co-ops to make use of that kind of approach. We're hoping to get around it by the nonprofit structure, by sort of pooling the small co-ops together so they could access RSP, ability to use RSPs for their investments. So that would be lovely to see that change. But for whatever reason, you know, it's very hard to get government to want to change the Income Tax Act. I mean, it did function very well for small co-ops earlier and small entities, but I think there was some sort of fear around abuse of the system, which I guess could be done, but it's quite rare in worker co-ops. We're not aware of any doing this. So anyway, those are some. I think we want to see more education and training around how to do co-op development, but I think that isn't so much a policy issue as a resource issue, because there's actually good training available through Co-op Zone for doing co-op development. We're about to launch a startup program for worker co-ops called, well, it's been developed in Quebec. It's called the Parcours Co-op, and right now we actively are looking for a translator because we have resources to do the translation to English. And that's an RFP that just went out, and it's going to expire in a little over a week. So if anybody is interested, they could quickly get in touch with me before June 8th. Anyway, and then we're going to offer that. But, you know, that's available. It's not a policy concern. It's just resourcing. Because the reason that I think that it's hard for Co-op Zone Developers Network to get people to take their training has to do with the fact that it's so hard to get paid work at the end of it, you know. So I think it does come down to that in significant part. We have decent legislation these days in most of Canada, I think, for cooperatives, which is helpful, you know, so that's good. And not everywhere. Some provinces could be stronger for sure, but most are good.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say, Hazel Corcoran, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation series, and I wish you the best of luck with your work with Canadian Workers Cooperative Federation in the coming weeks and months, and I'll be keeping my eye on your website and to see what's happening with all of your proposals and your projects.
Okay, thank you, and I wish you all the best as well, Jen. Thanks.
Thank you.